for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to enter into the discussion on what is such an important issue, and to just note two things before I begin my remarks. I appreciate that there's been a somberness about the chamber, a seriousness to which this issue has been taken here this evening, and the importance to take these things very seriously. And I would suggest, although certainly, and I know myself as well, there's many issues where you'll show passion and partisanship and that sort of thing, but this, I believe, is one of those instances where you see that there is a genuine care and concern, and albeit there would be differences in terms of what the application of some of those policies are, and we've heard a few of those differences here this evening, Mr. Speaker, but it is some of the discussions to which we've been able to have this evening that I think show the strength of what our democratic institutions in being able to respond to this sort of thing, and then to reflect on some of the words. And of course, the blues don't come out in live time, but just to my previous colleague from Manitoba who had shared about there's been lots of work done, but it's making sure that we, and I'm paraphrasing, but that we actually don't just talk about it, but the work actually needs to get done. And I couldn't agree more on ensuring that that does happen. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to start my speech by recognizing those who have lost their lives so tragically in the last number of weeks. And Mr. Speaker, if you would, I would like to name them, as I know a number of my colleagues have, into the record here this evening. Stephen Dedman, Danny Knife, Haas Lightning, Jack Pisha, Tammy Bateman, and Jason West, and acknowledge the trauma and loss to their families, friends, communities that are all suffering at this time. And Mr. Speaker, I could not imagine, and the youngest of which is 15 years old, but as a parent, my kids aren't quite there yet, but as a parent, I certainly could not imagine the loss of a child, and my heart goes out to those who are hurting, and certainly praying for them, standing with them as they grieve, and to hope that there can be action that is taken to ensure that unnecessary violence like this does not take more lives. And further, Mr. Speaker, and I won't go into details, but just to acknowledge, I know in my home community, very different circumstances, but just to acknowledge there was a couple of young men killed in a car accident the other day, and I know it's devastated the community, and my wife stopped by the school there and in the small town in which I live here today. Very different circumstances, so I'm not drawing a parallel on that, but the fact that loss impacts entire communities, and I know that is in fact the case. And Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the circumstances to which we are addressing here tonight, it is something that is not new. In fact, as I've had the opportunity over both my time in elected office, but also in my time as someone involved in politics, who cared deeply for the community and communities in which I've lived, but also as a political staffer, having the opportunity to engage with so many across specifically Western Canada, and I think of my time when I worked for the government of Saskatchewan, when Brad Wall was the Premier of Saskatchewan, and having many conversations, and I won't go into the specifics, I was a staffer sitting in the room with MLAs at the time, but Mr. Speaker, I think back, and as after learning about this debate, I've taken some time to think back to some of those conversations, including hearing from Indigenous people, Indigenous leaders who shared their challenges, shared their history very, very openly and honestly and profoundly, and how impactful that was, and there's a few instances, and I won't get into the specifics, but in communities specifically that had faced profound loss. I remember specifically there was a particular instance where there was three types of groups that were meeting with this group of MLAs over the course of a number of days, and one of them was Indigenous leaders, some chiefs, band councils, some folks and elders in the community, very respected. They shared their perspective in regards to the loss that these communities had faced. There was, we heard from police, both the leadership and some of the officers, very frank conversations about what had happened, was happening. And then there's a particular instance, Mr. Speaker, where there was one individual, and of course, as a staffer, you're trying to facilitate things, take notes, and for those who have been staffers in this place, and I know there's probably staffers watching, it's sometimes a little bit chaotic when you're a political staffer, as I know my colleague was at one point in time. But it was one of those moments where the interaction spoke. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words. And this, although wasn't a picture that was taken, it was watching the interactions spoke as much as the words that were shared during the course of that meeting. And it was sharing how there had been broken trust with authority figures, including police, not limited to, but including police. And I think back to the look on the face of the individual who it took guts and courage that I could not imagine for this individual to come and speak to this group of elected officials and to share her story. And I think back to, again, just watching, and then of course I heard those words, and I won't share any of those specifics, but just the profound courage and how the call was to listen. The call was to listen. The call was to engage and to ensure that in particular her voice, but the voices of so many were given the opportunity to be heard, and then that there would be change that was brought about as a result. And it was that interaction. It will leave a deep impact. It has and will continue to over the course of as I've reflected over the last number of hours, the need to ensure that Indigenous peoples are empowered, given the opportunity to be a part of that change. And I know since having the honor and privilege to serve the people of Battle River Crowfoot, and Mr. Speaker, I've mentioned this before, Battle River, it's named after the Battle River, which is a small river. It's a spring-fed river, interestingly enough, that has deep Indigenous history. And Crowfoot, named after the famous Chief Crowfoot, and who while there's lots of places in Calgary that are named Crowfoot, much of the area that he and his people spent their time was the plains that now represent the area, that are now a part of the area that I have the honor of representing. And as I've reflected on this, just the rich history and the lessons that can be taught. And in fact, if I could, Mr. Speaker, what was, again, this won't be a surprise. I know you and many others have heard me talk about farming. Proud to be part of a multi-generational family farm. It's a little too wet to be combining today, but my dad's hoping that he can get into the field tomorrow. But what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is that when you're in a field, and in particular, we have a number of fields that are adjacent to some native prairie land. And this is grassland that is thousands of years old. Time immemorial, it's been grassland. In fact, the roots of that grass goes down, in some cases, 20, 30 feet into the earth. And it's absolutely incredible, the nutritional value alone for livestock, for cattle, and of course the buffalo that preceded settlers heading west. But what is interesting, the reason why I share this is because the profound impact when you look at the sky in a rural area when you're farming, and in particular when you're near an area where you knew that it wasn't that many years ago in the context of time, you have the opportunity to see the same stars that would have provided guidance to peoples that traverse these lands not that long ago. In fact, I was sharing with my children at one point in time, Mr. Speaker, because there's a number of historical cairns in the area. The Spencer Historical Society had shared, and in particular, there was 2 cairns dedicated to the Northwest Mounted Police. Of course, now we know that as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I would note that we have a history in this country. While there's a lot of bad, there is things that set us apart from and compared to the Americans. And I would note that one of the things that set us apart was the fact that we didn't go in with the military when that was the story of many of the relationships with Indigenous peoples south of the 49th parallel. Now, I'm not saying that there's not bad there. I'm not saying that at all, Mr. Speaker. But what I am suggesting is that we have seen how we can work together. And as we look at the history, and in particular, one of these cairns is where it was the coming into force of Treaty 6. And this Sounding Lake, it's a dry lake bed. And it's filled on wet years and is dry on dry years. And it's known to be lots of grassland in that area. Quite a large lake, at least for rural Alberta, where our lakes are quite different than certainly some of the lakes you would find around here in the mountains. But it's reading this, Karen, it talks about how there was up to 10,000 people, the vast majority of which were Indigenous peoples, at the coming into force of Treaty 6, in particular this. And it's about a mile from that location. There is a cairn that marks for some former barracks of the Northwest Mounted Police, and how there is that opportunity to see that working together. And that was seen at the time a hopeful moment. And certainly there's been many broken promises since that the late 1800s when those agreements were signed. But Mr. Speaker, we can look back in history. I took my kids to, and in anticipation of Truth and Reconciliation Day, of course, coming at the end of this month, where I'm looking forward to being in the constituency on that day, although there's not a huge number of flights that it'll have to probably be a red-eye coming back that night. But what is profound, because I took my kids to share some of the rich Indigenous history across East Central Alberta, and there were two things in particular that stood out, Mr. Speaker, and one was the Dry Island Buffalo Jump, and the history, again, thousands of years, 3,000 years, they think, that area up until just a few hundred years, long before it's time that is hard to imagine. A space, sacred space. You have the ribstones, the Manitou stone, which there's ongoing work that's being done. That stone comes from my area. So the reason I share those things, Mr. Speaker, is because as we see tragedy, we see families that are broken as a result of institutions that are not working properly. We need to show care and compassion, and we need to figure out how to empower those individuals with an absolutely incredible history. A ability to see justice, and that may look a little bit different than what some in this place think it should, in terms of what that looks like. And I had the opportunity just last week, the Camrose and Police Chief LaGrange there in Camrose, along with my provincial counterparts, the Provincial Minister of Justice and Minister of Public Safety, had the opportunity to attend the Alberta Community Justice Awards hosted in the beautiful city of Camrose that I have the honor of representing. And what's interesting, and again, this wasn't planned, Mr. Speaker, but when I was asked to speak about this very important issue, it was I started reading through the biographies of the award recipients, and a number of them that are showing how we can incorporate restorative justice, Indigenous history, ensuring that there are community-led solutions so that we can reduce the number of these tragedies. Mr. Speaker, making sure that victims are supported. One of the tragedies that exists is the number of victims that are not getting the support that they need. We look at some of the other major issues that we are facing. And my colleague earlier, the Shadow Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations from the Conservative side talked about the need for Indigenous-led solutions for policing, and the need for that, absolutely. And in the meantime, while there is contracts, and he dove into some of the details about the tripartite agreements that exist and how there needs to be some changes to those sorts of things to ensure that it's reflective of the modern reality. But Mr. Speaker, what the key in the midst of all that is to ensure that we are listening to those community leaders that are truly able to inform us of what's happening on the ground. And as we partner with them, and it was mentioned by a number of my colleagues how it's not needed, the thing that is not needed is an Ottawa Knows Best solution. But what is needed is to ensure that Indigenous people are empowered. And I know as I've spoken to Indigenous leaders over the last couple of years in particular, and I know the leader of the official opposition, the member from Carleton, has talked a lot about ensuring that Indigenous communities across Canada are empowered. And in particular, he's talked a lot about the policy platform in relation to resource development and making sure that Indigenous peoples have the opportunity to benefit, to be the architects of their future, to be not held up by gatekeepers, a bloated bureaucracy that doesn't understand the reality on the ground, nor the customs and demands of local communities, to make sure that people ultimately are empowered. And that includes, Mr. Speaker, a massive issue has been ensuring that we are able to address some of the challenges in relation to addiction. I'm sure my colleague from the Shadow Minister for Addictions will, I'm sure, have an opportunity to speak more about this, but to give the opportunity in an Indigenous specific way. And each community will probably look at that differently, and that's okay. We shouldn't be afraid of that. But the worst thing that could happen is an Ottawa Knows Best approach that doesn't reflect the reality of what communities need. And to ensure that there is the opportunity, as the leader of the official opposition talks about, to ensure we can bring our loved ones home. That is the need for every segment of those who call Canada home. And that is very, very needed. And I've talked to folks in Indigenous communities, Mr. Speaker, who want to see that. And I know there was examples shared about how, whether that's banning drugs and needing searches. And in fact, I'd made a note and that it was mentioned earlier that there's a particular airport in this country that where some of the fly-in communities in Northern Ontario in particular, and a practical solution which I would hope that will be acted on. It's something that seems like it's too simple not to act on, Mr. Speaker, although sometimes the too simple stuff in Ottawa seems to be the stuff that is unnecessarily complicated. But a suggestion was made earlier by a colleague from another party that when you fly Air Canada in and out of that particular airport, happened to be Thunder Bay he was referring to, you have to go through security, like we all do when we fly to the nation's capital to go to work. But Mr. Speaker, what was said, and it's the first time that I had heard this, so I share this. There's a few different people in the room here at this point in time, is to say, Mr. Speaker, that it turns out that there are no searches on planes that go into these fly-in communities when they are not through that particular terminal. And Mr. Speaker, that seems to me, and the suggestion was made, that those searches should take place, that there should be the basic level of security, and that's something that Transport Canada could simply get on, and that would help stop the flow of drugs, these toxic poisons, from a center into those fly-in communities. So, Mr. Speaker, in the couple of minutes that I have left, I would just note as well, if I could, the miscarriage of justice is something that is an important issue to ensure that we have action taken for those who have not been served well by a justice system. That and then, Mr. Speaker, I would simply conclude by saying this: we need to have a system across the board, whether that is the police, including those in Indigenous communities. We need to have a court system. We need to have treatment for those who are facing addiction. We need to have the whole cross-section of what the system is in our country. It needs to reflect the realities that Canadians are facing, because increasingly there's tragedies like this that remind us that there are those who are falling through the cracks, Mr. Speaker. And as I believe colleagues from all parties this evening have reminded us, it's time for us not to just talk about the solutions, but to make sure we act on it. And Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that the simple solution to that is let's empower these communities, because they're the ones with the answers that can truly make transformative change, so that we don't have to have these sorts of debates again, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I've been listening to the debate this evening, and one of the things that comes across my mind is the fact that we have a standing committee, the Indigenous Northern Affairs Standing Committee. And as all other standing committees, there's always an agenda that's set. I know individuals like Grand Chief of the AFN, Cindy Woodhouse, who's always been a very strong advocate for Indigenous policing. And I know that the member from Sydney, Victoria, has actually moved a motion at that standing committee saying that we should be conducting a study on the issue. And the question that I have for the member opposite, he knows that having an emergency debate and discussion is not that common on the floor of the House of Commons, especially on this issue. Given that we're having that debate tonight, would he not agree that the standing committee should look at what's been suggested by the member from Sydney, Victoria, so that we can actually have that committee deal with what is being talked about this evening? It seems that all members, all parties, want to see something happen on the issue. And would he not agree that this is something that should be bumped on the agenda, on the study agenda? I understand there's a pecking order amongst the different political parties, but all political parties seem to see this as a very important issue, Mr. Speaker, to the degree in which we're actually having an emergency debate. Would he not agree that this should be a priority for the committee, given that they have a motion to actually deal with the issue before it?
The Honourable Member for Battle River Crewfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I am not a regular member of that committee. I have had the opportunity to sit and be a part of a number of those meetings, but I would encourage that member. It's been interesting because a number of the government members have stood up this evening and talked about all the great things they've done. Yet I have an Auditor General's report in front of me that talks about how, while they're great at making announcements, they are certainly not great at following through on ensuring that the things that they announce actually result in deliverables, whether it's for Indigenous peoples. this is not limited to Indigenous peoples, but certainly it has a devastating effects, as we're seeing here. And I would the context for this, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that member would go to his members of that committee and encourage them to take an approach that would allow for this to take place, and not just the parliamentary secretary to which he referenced, but to make sure that happens. Because, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the circumstances to which we're talking about here, these tragic deaths, whether it be violent crime in general across the country, of which I know First Nations are disproportionately affected by that, there is a need to take action. And unfortunately, this government talks about action, but when it comes through to actually following through, Mr. Speaker, even the Auditor General, it's not just Conservatives that say this, but even the Auditor General says they just simply don't have that follow through.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
And I'd like to thank the member for his intervention. As a member of the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee, I'd like to confirm that we have studied policing of Indigenous peoples in Canada. There's been multiple reports already. We've got great reports like the MMIWG calls for justice, as well as TRC's call for action. So I agree with him completely that it's time for action. No more reports, no more recommendations. There's enough of those. And I think one of the tangible solutions that I think we need to remind this House that was offered to them is that core funding need to be given to Indigenous policing. It's really quite unfortunate that, for example, it's become part of a systemic racism when RCMP is core funded. They don't need to negotiate to the same level as Indigenous policing organizations, whereas it's that much more of a struggle for Indigenous policing. So does the member agree that that's part of the systemic racism that needs to be addressed so that we're seeing core funding being provided to Indigenous peoples to police themselves?
The honourable member for Battle River Crewfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. And to note, I use a reference quite often. It's action. That's where the rubber hits the road. It's actually getting stuff done. And I'm glad to hear that the committee, in fact, it's interesting, she as a member of the Northern Affairs, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee, answered the Parliamentary Secretary's question, and it's not time for more reports. I know there's the 94 calls to action from the TRC. I believe it's 231 from the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women. It's time to make sure action happens and to ensure that when it comes to policing, I am, and I will be the first to admit, I'm not an expert on the models and whatnot that need to happen, but that's where Indigenous communities need to be the ones that lead the conversation to ensure that they have, whether it's funding, whether it's the institutions, whether it's the justice supports, to ensure that they are set up for success. Because, Mr. Speaker, I can also share, and because I've spoken to some Indigenous leaders that have said this stuff has to be done right, and it has to be done right in partnership with those Indigenous communities, because there'd be nothing worse for a system to be brought in that's dictated from an office tower in a capital city that then ends up failing. And imagine the pain and the hurt of not only facing the challenges they face from historical institutions, but not doing it right with an attempt to fix an institution, and imagine the trauma that would be associated with that. So to exactly her point, to make sure that this is addressed in a way that actually gets the job done so that Indigenous communities are able to be empowered in a way that makes sure that not only this stuff, these sorts of tragedies doesn't happen, but, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Canadians or that Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast are well served.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for his insightful speech and sharing some of the history of the land he represents and the place name history of his writing. Actually, it was actually quite interesting. I know one of the things that I found very shocking and frustrating as I've listened to countless speeches from the Liberal government on this is them bragging about all the money that they have committed, and as you've highlighted in your speech, the Auditor General's report is pretty clear that they've spent money, but there's no results. And I know you've mentioned about the Auditor General's report, and you do tend to go through those pretty thoroughly, and I'm just wondering if you have any further insights that you could share with us about how this is just another case of the Liberals promising, patting themselves on the back, giving an Ottawa knows best answer, and yet when push comes to shove, there's no real results for it. We still have First Nations communities across this country that don't have clean drinking water after 9 years.
The honourable member for Battle River Crewfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And in reading this report from the Auditor General, it is damning how while money is being allocated and in many cases being spent, it is not ending up where it needs to be. And Mr. Speaker, I would simply share, related directly to this, but on the justice file very specifically, and is how the FSIN in Saskatchewan, I've had the opportunity to meet with various leaders over the course of my time, talked about how an example of this is in relation to the parole Control Board. How while the Liberals talk about all the great things they do, including in relation to the justice system, the real consequences of what they've delivered is death and destruction in community. And this is not something that I'm simply making up or embellishing. To read the words of the FSIN are absolutely astonishing. So it's taking the dollar question and how that affects the lives of Indigenous peoples. It is truly, it has resulted in absolute tragedy. And Mr. Speaker, we have to do better as a parliament, as a government, to ensure that whether it's core administration, whether it's respecting Indigenous communities, whether it's making sure that communities are empowered, dollars are spent. Mr. Speaker, we got to do better. We owe it to Indigenous communities across this country to make sure it happens.